Welcome everybody. But I also want to just do a quick shout out to our sponsor, Lucid. As everybody knows, past few events, Lucid has sponsored the Product Hive group as a gold sponsor. Our first annual sponsor that we've had for the group. I just want to give them a thank you for their support and in the group. So want to thank them, and then we'll stop sharing that and we can jump into the conversation. So let me just make sure you and I are pinned, and then we can go from there. But yeah, I want to just welcome Jasmine and thank her for the time that she's taken to spend with us today and chat about this topic. I know it's a topic that has been talked about before. For Product Hive, it's a topic that we haven't spent a ton of time on when it comes to the leadership, design management, and I'm really excited to just talk about your experience specifically and how you've been approaching it in your career. So I want to just give you an opportunity to kind of just tell us about yourself, kind of give everybody an intro to you, and kind of start from there, and then we'll go into it. How's that sound, Jasmine?
Sure. I should tell you all I am recovering from bronchitis. So my voice is super fancy right now, and I may be muting on and off to cough. So A, I'm sorry, and B, feel free to use the "you're muted" when I'm trying to talk. Also, a little shout out to Al. I see you. I see my newest teammate has joined, and I'm super excited to see you listening in. Okay, so I am a product design leader, a director of design at Dropbox. I've had a pretty abrupt career in a good way. I kicked off my design career in 2013 working in an agency, and then made my way through Facebook, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, led design there, and at Udacity, and Intercom, and through a COVID related event where we moved our entire design team from SF to Dublin, Ireland, which would have been super fun, but I couldn't do it. I found myself jobless this past year and ended up finding my role as a design leader at Dropbox. By education, I am formally trained twice because one degree isn't enough in graphic design. So definitely entered product design through the more UI visual side of it, and have sort of like fleshed out my experience into a well-rounded designer, and then eventually a leader. So that's me. I live with my husband, Tanner Christensen, which I know has done some chats, or a chat at least for you before, Ben, and 3 little dogs, French bulldogs, which I'm learning 3 dogs is too many dogs. It's just a lot when you're cooped up in a house all day. And so I'm willing to donate/sell one of them if anybody's I'm just kidding. I would never get rid of my dogs, but it's a lot.
I saw that social post that you posted on just the other day about those dogs are so cute. Your little Frenchies are
they're so cute, but they're just, 2 of them don't have 2 puppies at a time. Like 2 of them are still puppies, and they're rambunctious. Anyways, I love them. I do.
Oh, we could talk all day about dogs.
New topic.
We decided.
Sorry, everybody.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I kind of want to break down a little bit of your career for this group, because I think it's quite an interesting career. I mean, you've been design. There's some people that transition into design or that are career transitioners, but you've got a good experience. I know you've spent a long period of time. I want to kind of start in the IC world. I know you spent a good 5 years at Facebook, and I kind of want to hear a little bit about that experience of growth from those 5 years at Facebook.
Yeah, anything specific or just overview?
Yeah, well, the one interesting thing about Facebook is they call a lot of their designers just product designer. They don't really kind of showcase the leveling or responsibility.
Like if you're a senior or a junior.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear how that plays out with responsibilities and yeah, just how that.
Yeah. Okay. I have mixed feelings on
I like
the
about
the,
mixed
the
feelings.
naming there. Yeah. I mean, I think leveling plays a role. It plays a role in knowing where you're at, and there are internal levels at Facebook. But what I understand the intent to be was it without having levels or public facing levels, it's an equalizer. And so you can have an associate PM who's working with a senior designer. And if that associate PM can carry their own, they will be able to work at parity with a senior designer. And so the stripping away of levels just gives some bit of an equality and inequity. So I started off, I had done some work at a studio called Office as an intern, like extended intern, graphic designer doing branding, branding and packaging and all that fun stuff, which is what I thought I would do with my 2 degrees in graphic design. And I ended up doing my thesis project, and it was a UX project. Like I designed an app without having any idea of how to design an app. We didn't have a lot of curriculum at the Academy of Art, which is where I went on how to do that. So I just kind of figured it out. And I landed a job at a now defunct place called Hot Studio. And they hired me as an associate UX designer with no UX experience. And the way I got to Facebook is I was one of a team of maybe 15 folks who were contracting at Facebook, because Facebook, if you could believe it, like only had 35 designers at a time, or at the time, and now there's like hundreds, which is insane. Like to have come in as like not the 35th number designer in a row, but like capping out at 35. And what I found was I really thrived there, even though I came in as like an associate or a mid-level designer. I know it was a level 3. I can't remember what the roles are. But I was really well equipped to do the product design because I had the background in the visual design, the graphic design, and I had already gotten a job in UX. And so, you know, when we think of that combination of UX and UI, what I needed to layer on was the product thinking. And so I really soared there. And I did so by coming in with a humongous spirit of humility, because I had never worked with engineers before. And I knew that they would need to build what I had designed. And so I considered them my design partners. And I really got in there and made sure that we were designing and building together. And I think at the time I was the first designer on payments at Facebook. And I was working with 6 PMs. And I think something like 30 engineers, which is just insane. And so I was managing all these different streams of work and trying to figure out, how do you prioritize things? How do I invest? How do I design ahead? How do I empower engineers to design? And I just review. And so like sort of getting thrown into the deep end of, I'd never done this job before. And I really like, I didn't know what the role was supposed to be. And I made mistakes. I made tons of mistakes. I had a supportive team who helped me through them. And I ended up getting promoted pretty quickly. I think I had 2 promotions within the span of 2 years to get to what we would have considered a senior designer. And when we think about the levels, I think that was actually a great example of, I didn't have any bars on me. I didn't have anybody around me going, hey, you're just a junior designer. You should only be doing this. I just took that wide open space and said, I'm going to do the best I can here. And I'm going to find my network of support. So I ended up working on the payments team and ended up being the payments lead. And I think there were like 6 people on the team as we brought in commerce and other payments designers too. And I think I had reached senior designer level by then. I worked for a couple more years. I worked on privacy, which is proactive privacy, which is just kind of funny to think of now. And then I moved on to work on a special team, which was the K-12 team that ended up being it's a curriculum-based platform for self-directed learning that a charter school is working with. And they moved that over to Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and I went with it. And during that time, I became a staff level designer as well. So it was 5 years with very short growth. And then the quick story is after IC land, and then I was actually never a design manager. I just went straight to director.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. The whole 6 PMs, 30 developers trying to keep a hold of all of that. I mean, I wouldn't say that's completely uncommon, but that you find in the startup world or the large enterprise world. So how long were you a contractor before you became a full-time employee?
1 month.
A month?
1 month, yeah. They put me on a project on the payments team, and we got acquired a month later. And I just like to say I never went home. I think one of the reasons like I hear designers today that they're like, oh, I'm pulled every which way by PMs, and like I don't know how to prioritize my work, and I need time for design thinking. And I think one of the ways I succeeded was I didn't push back on it. Like I went with it, and I just said yes, and then I figured it out. And so allowing me to be a support person within the team, and to be not necessarily a service person, but an active collaborator rather than a blocker. I built relationships with people where we did some really big things. I think one of them on that team was I was the lead designer on the design for Messenger and payments, which I think is now just actual Facebook Pay, which is a concept we had way back in the day. I led design on Safety Check, which was a hackathon. And so we ended up doing some really big sort of meaningful project launches, but to me, it was because of the foundations that I had made as a more junior designer, trying to build those relationships and trying to ship good work and learn what good work is, rather than just coming in and saying, I have an opinion on design and design should be this way. I had to figure out what design should be like at a company like Facebook. And honestly, like we were still figuring that out as a discipline. Like, what does it mean for design to have a yield seat at the table? And what does it mean for design to be a product partner, especially in an engineering driven company?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really want to dig deeper into that, what you're alluding to there of designers can become their own blocker in some way.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk about that a little bit? How a designer might becoming their own blocker because of the unhappiness that they might have with a particular process, or the unhappiness that they might have with the amount of work that they're trying to prioritize. I'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
I should caveat that by saying this is just me thinking out loud, and that's what I tend to do. And sometimes I'm wrong. So I welcome it if I am. Oh, yeah. I think there's something to being, principled, having things that you believe in. But I also think it's important to be able to let go of some of your principles. And by that, I mean, like, there might just be things that you believe in that you believe to be true. And entering in this idea of like, what is the possibility of me being wrong? And so, for example, we have a lot of students who come in from university, and they'll say like, this is how you do design. And all of a sudden they get into startup world, and that is not how you do design. It's not some like, cookie cutter already baked in process. You may need to pull different parts of the process. And you might not be doing wireframes in the way that you used to. And so how do you learn to adapt and be willing to say, well, why is it different here? Is it because we don't have time? Does it mean that we need to shortcut a process? Is that okay? What are we missing out on? What's the cost of that? And maybe the cost is like, you didn't do as many iterations as you wanted to do. And so therefore we're going to ship the first thing that comes to mind. That's not ideal. Like, you want to make sure you come up with the best solution. But if you're a small team and you're, trying to find your product market fit, and it's just about like testing and putting things out there, you'll learn much more about the business by maybe, being a little bit more loosely held on your principles and your beliefs. And values is probably something we don't want to enter in this conversation, but how can you provide flexibility in order to learn things that you might not know yet? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really hard for junior designers or younger designers that haven't gone through that experience yet to have that flexibility or to flex that muscle a little bit. And it really is interesting to see how sometimes we can be our own blocker by trying to create this idealistic view of how I want to work, rather than working
Yeah.
being flexible with the way I work.
Yeah, I think there's sometimes like a paralyzation that comes with that or for other reasons, when you start to get in a new environment. That can be in a new job too. Like, coming to Dropbox for me, it was in a totally different environment, going from a 600 person company to a 3,000 person company. And you just go, whoa, there's a lot of things I'm not, familiar with. I'm a little bit confused by, I have a lot of questions about. And so it's easy, in those situations, or when the process isn't what you feel like you're used to, just stop and go like, I can't handle this, or I don't know what to push on first. And so just like sort of taking a step back and just observing, or allowing yourself maybe even to be swept up in it a little bit, just to have some experience and to be able to practice for a little bit, rather than just saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like you can sort of like, that stop and think might be a good thing for some people, but it might actually be the thing that makes you sort of overanalyze or go too deep. And I think a lot about like starting a new company too. Like there's so many folks who they just want to jump right in and they just want to do the first week's worth of work. And that might be healthy, but it's also healthy to kind of stop back and sort of like watch what's going on, and then see, really intentionally choose what you want to get swept up in.
Yeah, I really like that. You had mentioned that you kind of led particular projects. Can you kind of describe what you mean by leading when you're not called a leader, or
like IC leadership?
Yeah, like a little bit more of the IC leadership. When you said I led the payments,
Yeah.
what did that mean?
Yeah, so on that project, we had 3 designers on the payment side. And, my role as lead was to make sure that we had people working on the right things that, highlighted their skills and made sure we made the project on time. And to me, that was actually something that felt like early management. And for example, we had they were actually both acquired from Hot Studio along with me. We had somebody who was a visual designer and somebody who was a UX designer. And I was sort of that hybrid of both. And so, initially I had it set up so that the UX designer would be doing wireframes and then the visual designer would be doing the polish. And we ended up switching that up just because it wasn't the right fit. The visual designer had a strong appetite to become a full stack product designer. And so I ended up like switching that to have her be responsible for iOS. Myself and my intern at the time took Android and I took web. And then we had the other designer doing some more foundational things elsewhere. And so like making sure that we've got our team set up. It wasn't so much in a developmental way, but that the skills matched what the need was. And then also I worked with, our TPM, our technical program manager, to make sure we had phased and planned when the work was due. And then I'd go in and be the representative when we were working with, the messenger team that was working on other things, and that we'd, leading reviews and making sure I was connecting with the PM regularly. And so to me, it was, mostly project leadership. So maybe 80% project leadership and maybe 20% team leadership. And then I also had to just make sure that I delivered, the best designs. Like even being the lead, it doesn't mean that I'm not designing. I was still making sure I owned at least a track and a half of work.
Yeah, I think that's one piece that gets omitted a lot about in conversations around leadership and IC lead aspects of fully understanding the makeup of a team, the ownership and responsibilities of those particular people, versus when you're called a director or when you're called a manager. You don't necessarily need to be managing an individual to be able to help lead them in some ways. And I think often some designers get in their head that they can't lead unless they're given a title or given that responsibility. And I hate how much we talk about titles associated with the capabilities of what we can do and how we limit ourselves with those things. So it's really interesting to hear that level. I know you mentioned briefly before that you kind of jumped from being a lead to a director. I know you went from kind of leading at Facebook and then Zuckerberg Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that span of going from, okay, I'm a lead at Facebook to the initiative to now I'm a director?
Sure. So I had a pretty unique experience in that when I was moving over to Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So we moved the project, and this was this learning platform. And I had a choice whether to stay at Facebook and go to another team or move on with the project. And we were doing really meaningful work on personalized learning and self-directed development for high school kids. And I was really passionate about it. And what happened was my manager at the time decided not to go with the project. She decided to stay at Facebook and actually go back to an IC. Figured the management thing wasn't for her. And so I became sort of interim manager, and it wasn't something that, just something that somebody had to build the design team. There was no design team at CZI. There was no tech team. Anybody who chose to move over were the foundations of that team. And so I found myself in a place where I was the people leader, and I was the leader, and I was playing two roles, and I was the staff level designer. And it was really hard. And I think one of the things I notice now is that many ICs equate management with mentorship, and see sort of just that, if I'm mentoring and develop people and responsible for their careers, then that is management. And management is so much more than just people leadership. Management and directorialship ends up being a lot about, business strategy, looking at, cross-org development and partnership with your go-to-market operations, any sort of sales and marketing and brand that's associated with that. It has to do with a lot of operational planning, a lot of organizational planning, and just generally being responsible for everything. I mean, when you are a design manager or a business leader, everything is on you, and it's much different than just much more beyond than just management. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up having to build a team. And so I'd interviewed before, sure, and previous companies I've been a manager, but I hadn't yet built recruiting operations from the ground up. And so that's something I figured out how to do. And we later hired a recruiter who helped polish what I had done. I hadn't figured out what it looks like to, create process at a new company. And so I did a lot of this in collaboration with my teammates at the time, where we sort of went and said, well, we have, plug and play practices we can use from Facebook. Do we want to keep them as is forever, look at them later, or change them now? And so we worked through all of this. And even by doing that sort of audit of like, hey, what does actually this design team need in terms of the business to thrive? And I took a lot of that work on. And I was still leading a project full time, which I look back on and I'm like, I'm just insane. Like, here I am sick talking to you when I should probably be taking another day off. I have no boundaries and no limits, which is a bad thing. But I really learned sort of the mass of what this is. And I've learned from that experience, and I'm really interested in building good foundations, building good business foundations, building good process foundations, operational people, all of that stuff. And it just so happened, I was recruiting for my own boss, the director we were going to hire, and it was like a level or two above me. And LinkedIn just started, doing its thing and being like, hi, I see you're searching for director roles, director people. Do you want a director role? And this Udacity post came up, and it was like, I read through it and I was like, this is way above my level. I was like, but it's me. Like, it's describing me. And I went with this whole, I have a best friend who interviews for every role she possibly can. She's made huge leaps in her career by doing that. I don't do that. I tend to be a loyalist. I stayed at Facebook for 5 years. And so I just kind of went with it, like, what's the worst that could happen? And I did, one screen, one phone call interview, and one on-site, and I got the job. And it was insane because I had never interviewed when I may have had 2 coffee chats, but I always shut everything down because I was so happy at Facebook. I was learning, I was growing, they were treating me well. It wasn't as contentious as it is now. And I just I decided that there are some times that you need to take small steps, and there's sometimes that you need to take big leaps. And for me, it was honestly like a 50% pay cut. It was doing something I had never done before. I didn't, I didn't ask all the questions I should have asked, but I went for it. And it ended up being great for 6 months and really hard for 6 months. And I had to take a leap again, and, did a similar thing. But it ended up just being a question of, I wasn't growing in the way I wanted to grow at CZI anymore. I would still need to be a designer, and that sort of world had opened up to me. That leadership was really what I wanted to do. People leadership, business leadership. And I wasn't going to have the opportunity to do that at CZI. And so it was time. And, now 3 jobs later, here I am leading a substantial size of the org within Dropbox.
Yeah, that's awesome. So there's a lot in there that I kind of want to unpack, because
I've told the story a few times if you can't tell.
But it's a good story. And one that stood out to me in particular is and I think it felt like you kind of brushed over that for a minute. Like, I took a 50% pay drop to to make this change in your life. I don't think people talk about that aspect very often of what you're sacrificing for the other thing that you're trying to improve. Do you want to talk about that a little bit of like,
Sure.
I mean, money's not everything to everyone, or it is everything to everyone, but I would love to just kind of hear your take on that.
I actually love talking about money, not in specifics, but so I grew up in a like below poverty level family. My dad was unemployed for most of my growing up. Still privileged, still white, still have a lot going for me. But I had sort of, known what not having any money looks like. And so I worked for 6 years in San Francisco when I came out here with a job that paid me like no more than maybe 40 grand a year. And I worked minimum wage jobs to get myself through grad school. And so money is very important to me. And I've always kind of approached it with the perspective of, even if it's not the money, it's the money that affords me a life where I don't have to worry. And I have grown up my entire life worrying until I got into tech, worrying about my funds and what living paycheck to paycheck meant, and never being able to think about my future. And Tanner and I were able to buy a house a couple of years ago in San Francisco, a 740 square foot house. It is not a big house, but like owning my own home is very, very cool. But yeah, I think once Facebook has what we call the golden handcuffs. Like, when I started, their stock was ridiculously low, like $22 or something like that a share, and it went up to over 300. And so, the gains on that are enormous. And so I finally, got a taste of what it was like to be really financially well off. And I think there was something there where, as long as I was fine and those refreshers kept coming, it made it really hard to leave. And so when I left, and CZI did some special thing when I came over of giving me some, substantial sum of money to make that more even as a transfer. But when I left, I walked away from some obscene amount of money, like $350 a year or $350 a year. That's not obscene, $350K a year. And it was a real question I had. It's like, how do you weigh those trade-offs of like, I know I'm going to grow more here, but I know that I'm going to, be less secure. And I was making probably less than a senior IC at Facebook. And to me, that was insane. And, it was the first time I had worked at a place that, had stock options, and Udacity, had an IPO track, and they ended up having to change their product market fit like 3 different times. The same thing at Intercom. Like I came in and there's stock options, and it's a different challenge when you're going in as a leader and you're saying, I'm not just going to sit back and take these gains when they come. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to be part of the leadership team that helps drive us to success and helps pay our people financially and with recognition for all the work we put in to have us go through that profitability moment. And I was willing to do the work. And like, frankly, like Intercom was my place. Like I love Intercom. I believe in them. I would work there again in a heartbeat, because working on that leadership team was such a learning experience and was such a magical moment in my life. But I think that's something that, your values change. I actually I don't know if I can access it really quickly, but I have a screenshot that I keep on my desk that basically talks about my how I evaluate things. And usually this fluxes a little bit, but usually the first thing is people. Like I want to work with really, really great people. I want to work with kind-hearted people who are collaborators, who are willing to debate when it's hard, who are going to support each other and challenge each other. The second thing is usually personal growth. Am I going to grow? Because if I'm not becoming a better leader, it means I'm not doing the service I need to do for the people below me in trickling that down and helping create space for them and lifting each other up. And then it usually has to do with things like work-life balance. I might have skewed too heavily on that one, given we were in a pandemic when I got laid off, and like, I just didn't know what it was going to be like afterwards. And then it usually has something to do with comp or something like that afterwards. So I tend to keep those same things. They just shift. And right now, even though I'm compensated well at Dropbox, my comp probably falls a 5 out of 5. It's not the most important thing that I work for, but I do have the luxury of having, if I should lose my job for any reason, I do have a decent reputation, and I do have a great portfolio behind me that I don't have to rely on that substantial income in a way that I might have when I was younger.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think there's each person's individual story around their growth, the financial needs that they have. It varies depending on all of it, and it's just interesting some of the stories that we have around when we make a choice for one reason or another. I do want to dig into like how you organize your teams and the structure. You've been a director for multiple companies now. I'd love to hear how how those teams have been organized, how you organize them at Dropbox, or any of the three that Udacity, I think it's, and then Intercom and Dropbox, right? I'd
Yep.
love to just hear your story around how you organize things.
So I've recognized in my history that I've only worked at really true product companies. And that I would differentiate from, well, Udacity was a little bit different. I think we were in a debate of whether we were a product company or an education company, like, i.e. is what we're serving the content we're creating, or is it the platform by which we serve the content? Facebook is a product company. CCI is a philanthropic company, but I wasn't there like technically for long enough to disassociate it from Facebook. Intercom is a true product company. Dropbox is a true product company. And so when I think of organization, it's usually around decentralized design orgs where we have EPD, so you might call it engineering product design, or R&D, research and development. Usually it has a triad, which is a lead of an equal partner from engineering, product, and design. Sometimes data comes in and out, sometimes research does. And so most of the companies I've worked at have had, a peer group like myself that's EPD, area leads below them that are EPD, and then teams below them that are EPD. And so when I look at that as balance for, product development, it makes sure that we have that through line of, product strategy and design thinking and process and high execution at every level. And that to me is the most successful organizational model that I've seen. There's many ways to do this. If you're working in-house, you may end up working more as a service organization where you're sort of like given projects like an agency. But I've mostly seen that one model, and it's what's the most effective. One of the challenges that I had at Udacity was we did have sort of a separate group that was working on a new business type venture, and the intent from all of leadership was sort of to keep them there. And what I realized was with a small team, it's actually quite hard when someone is sort of burned out on a project. You need to move people around and make sure they're getting the right experiences. And, there I had a team, I think we went from like a team of 5 or 6 or 7 to 20. And so with contractors in all different disciplines, but the movement, the bigger you get, is really, really useful to make sure you're not only retaining people, but giving them the right opportunities to make sure that they can succeed. And as your organization grows, you have a little bit more flexibility with that, but the structure underneath it becomes really important. So right now I manage 4 areas. I have 3 area leads, and then within them, there's each one of those area leads has maybe anywhere from 3 to 5 teams. And they'll be under things like mobile, which Al has just joined, or core experience, or different parts of our business. On Intercom, I led our messenger area as well as our growth team. So similar organizational makeup.
And when you say those 4 area leads, those are IC leads, like you talked about being
those are they're managers.
They're managers. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing for terminology. We use lead a lot at Dropbox, but it you can use lead as a designer title, and that might mean you're paid to lead the team, or it might be you're like the lowercase lead and you're just the go-to. You could also use a staff level designer or a principal, which I know we've talked about a little bit, but they tend to mean different things at different companies. It's always interesting when I'm sourcing or recruiting or interviewing folks. I'm like, what did that mean for you? Because we don't have standardized roles as an industry. I don't know that we need to. But yeah, it can be confusing. Those are area managers.
Yeah. That's the clarification I wanted to make sure people understood when you were talking about a lead. And how, just for context for the rest of the group, when you talk about, say, Dropbox, how many designers total are there, or are there multiple directors? Is there a VP? Can you kind of give the broader bird's eye view of of the design team? Because you've got the horizontal EPD model aspects that decentralizes everything, but from a horizontal model of just design organization as a structure, can you give us an idea of what that looks like?
Yeah, it looks a lot like Facebook did. And I think there's sort of the big company model and the small company model. The big company model tends to be, there's a VP or, chief of design. Alistair Simpson is our VP of design. And then underneath him will be just like at Facebook, there's a number of either VPs or directors or senior directors that run orgs. And in the same way that engineering and product is shaped, the difference is, engineering tends to have more people. And so their cascade might go one level lower. So at the very bottom, not bottom, but at the very executional level, we might have one IC designer and product person working with 6 engineers. And so then they have a point person, which is the engineering manager. And so then, most organizations are done by, what they're focusing on the business. And so, for example, like at Facebook, you'll have a messenger pillar, and then underneath you'll have, the business messenger versus, maybe they might have an org around sort of like ingesting content into the messenger. Within business, they might have ads, like, so that it just tends to be a cascading structure. It's very similar at Dropbox, where we sort of have, different parts of the business, which I won't go into detail about. But I found at Udacity and Intercom, they'll often have the director and then skip the manager level and just have ICs. And the idea is they want to hire in their first leader in order to grow the team and then establish those middle managers. And so, for example, part of my time, I was the head of design at Udacity, running the whole design org. And over time, I promoted 2 of my senior/lead designers to managers to try out the people management thing and see if that was in their path. But initially, when I came in, I had, I think, whatever that number was, I'm just going to say 7, because 7 feels right to me right now. And by the time I grew it up to 12, I realized that wasn't scalable for me. And I needed to make sure I started to establish that middle management lever.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when you talk about the layer of leads that you have, are they also doing IC level work, or are they purely managing people?
They are purely managing, except for one of my managers is an amazing craftsperson. And so he'll sometimes still get in the Figma files for, strategy work or any sort of visuals or supporting his people. To me, when you need to be a manager or when we need to inject that layer, really has to do with scale. And so at Intercom, Emmett, the other senior director now, and I had sort of an agreement that the max capacity for someone to lead was probably about 5 people. And the idea is, when you are a people manager, you are not, at least at the companies I've worked for and for my expectations, you're not just a people manager. You're still a business leader and a strategy leader. And so a big part of your work is either leading some of that yourself or coaching your people and supporting your people on how to do that. And so when you have more than 5 reports, it ends up being difficult to, not just manage their careers, but also manage across and upwards and across to your other design manager peers or across to your EPD peers, and then keep tabs on all of the work and all of your operations, your design critiques, your reviews, how you keep tabs on your roadmap, all of those things. And so there's sort of like a breaking point where it feels comfortable. So I tend to not want to have, line managers for just 1 or 2 people. And line manager would be the same as that middle level of management, unless there's really, really a need. And so if I were to ever do something like have someone manage like 1 or 2 people, they'd probably be sort of still in that player coach model, where they're still acting in the work, but acting as a manager for a very new employee. And the intent there is sometimes around getting the person that experience, but usually around a business need.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good context. How do you approach career development with your teams?
That's a good question. Career development. I have a longstanding belief that all of your career development should be done within your job. And this is from sort of years of looking at folks and saying, hey, where do you want to grow? And hearing things like, I want to be a better public speaker. And I'm like, cool, how are you going to do that? And they're like, I'm going to take classes outside. Or, hey, I want to get better at my visual design. Okay, cool. How are you going to do that? I'm going to, get on Skillshare and take a bunch of classes. And I'm like, wow, we just created an F ton of extra work for you to do something that may or may not be related to your job. And so I like to keep the philosophy that your development areas should be practiced and enhanced in the work that you do daily. I don't want somebody to have a 20-hour side job in order to develop their skills. I want them to develop their skills at work. And so what I like to do is do some sort of, there's a couple different tracks. Like individually, I like to do some sort of side-by-side evaluation. I will pitch this as long as I can. I found this amazing talk from Tasha Urich, who's a business psychologist who did a TED talk on self-awareness. And she really talked about this concept of a dual evaluation, where if you see yourself the same way other people see you, then you're probably self-aware. And I can tie that directly back to skills. So if I say I'm good at this skill and my manager says I'm good at that skill too, I'm probably good at it. If I say I'm terrible at this skill and my peer looks up to me because they think I'm great at this skill, then I'm probably actually great at that skill, but I might not be self-aware enough to know it. And so one of the things I like to do, and I've done this at, I think most of the companies I've worked at, is sort of do this evaluation where I step back and evaluate my people. They do it for themselves. And then we come together and we have a conversation about it. Because what that does is and I do it from the rubrics we have internally. And what that does is it actually uncovers the areas within our jobs that, people are excelling in. They might have an area of opportunity in, and then we can decide together what to work on. And then it's often my job or their job to be seeking those opportunities. So there's first like looking at an individual level and making sure that we have people who are challenged and growing and thriving. And I think that's like, everybody wants to be challenged and growing and thriving. Like that's how many of us find satisfaction in our work. And then the other way I tend to look at it is like shape of the team. And so usually a great place to start is in our sort of pulse surveys or whatever you call them at whatever company. At least at bigger companies, they do them that say, where are we doing well? Where are we not doing well? And for example, one that I've worked on in the past and I'm currently working on is, hey, how do we think about career development? And, uncover things like, people want skill clubs. They want places where they can go and learn from each other. Or, people aren't sure of what this like principal path looks like versus manager. So can we talk about that more? And I think there's sometimes common themes that you can extract depending on the culture of the company that might be more valuable in one environment than another. And so looking at it from both sort of an individual and a team shape has been pretty helpful for me.
I like the thinking there. I have some questions about the rubric that you had mentioned. Is that something that HR builds across multiple disciplines, or is it something that the design discipline has created as a rubric?
I think it really depends on the maturity of the company. In my mind, you should have things that you value as a company. There's obviously going to be craft skills, but there could be, how do you care about like business impact? How do you want to measure that? How do you think about what you value in soft skills? Is learning and humility something you value, or is it a collaboration? And so I think it's useful to go through an exercise as a team to do that. And I much prefer orgs that are aligned across disciplines, just because like when we look at fairness in functions, like should designers be paid more than engineers? Is the role the same? Like there are actually public rubrics that evaluate levels against, think about customer service specialists or executive assistants. Like how do we create fairness in an org? And I haven't found it useful to go off as a design function and do this independently. Because there's actually like legal standards that you need to abide by. So I think a good practice is, if you don't have a rubric, is just to figure out, what are the 4 or 5 facets that the company wants to evaluate by. And then one of those is usually some sort of craft thing. And so, for example, in your designers, do you expect product strategy to be a piece of that, interaction design, visual design, and then get into the details of where those are. If you want a really great example, intercom.design was one that I developed with Emmett and team. I think John Coleman was a big part of that, but we have a public facing rubric there that you can sort of see what it looks like as you step change from level to level and what the different facets are in the details. And that, I believe, was synced with, at least with product. We were a little bit earlier in our maturity of getting those standards down.
Yeah. It's I totally agree. You can't do it on your own for sure, but having a good rubric definitely helps a lot. Speaking, going into hiring, I know you're doing a lot of hiring right now. Little plug for Dropbox if anybody wants to work for Dropbox. This is
Tons
the
of roles.
talk to.
I thought we were done, and all of a sudden we're like, we need more people.
Right. How do you? I know you're a strong believer in diversity in hiring and diversity in general. Same with the intersectionality of it all. How do you approach that in your hiring?
Yeah, I mean, I want people to walk away saying hiring people with diverse backgrounds is not that hard. Like I feel like we've made such a big deal about this, and we haven't actually, I say like leaders, and we actually haven't done the work to try and make change. And it's really frustrating for me. I look at my background, and I didn't grow up in wealth, and that's fine. But as I mentioned before, like just being white is so privileged. Like I get my foot in the door. I've gotten, jobs without interviewing. Like it's nuts how successful my career has been. And I have like a luxury of success even now, being a director at a reputable company. And even as a woman, like I've had, my own challenges in that, but I still think that doing the work is my responsibility. And so I worked really, really hard at Intercom to revise our interviewing process to make it more fair, just like in things of how we source. We were saying things like, let's source from big tech. Well, who dominates big tech? Even looking at Facebook is a bunch of white dudes that sort of made their own company, and 50% of them, don't quote me on that, but are still the C-suite leaders. And some of them leave and come back, but it's still not representative of the world that we serve. And so what I believe is I believe, of course, I believe in equality, but I believe in equity over equality. And by equity, I mean giving people the opportunity who may not necessarily individual, but may not from being in a group that's marginalized, giving them a fair shot and giving them a more fair shot than perhaps the person that has had the opportunity, or the group of people that have had the opportunity. And so I tend to look at this from a sourcing perspective. If I look at my natural pipelines at any company, it's usually, a ton of white men. And a ton of maybe even qualified white men, and that's great. What I want to do is not make decisions there, but make sure that I have a pipeline that's more representative, and then make sure that we do the comparison. And so that, to me, if anybody follows me on Twitter, I've been blasting lately, and I've offered to have individual conversations or give guidance to anybody who identifies as part of the BIPOC community. And what that's done is it's first of all, I've had like 300 conversations, which is nuts, and was so fun because I feel like I got to know so many people, like real human individuals that are different from me, and I love that. But what that's done is it's enabled me to give some personal guidance, and be able to say, hey, your visuals aren't there yet, or I think this is a great fit. You should apply for this role, though. And that's a tiny bit of guidance that most people won't get. They'll just submit their application to some black box and they get it or they don't. And I think one of the things that's just missing is feedback. There are places who are like, oh, I don't want to get feedback. Like it could be a lawsuit. It's a gift. Like to me, it's actually what we should be doing is giving people guidance so that they actually can go and improve what might be holding them back. And so taking this from a personal a personal perspective where I want to build relationships and help people grow, that's been really, really effective. And we had 3 roles. I'm super excited. We actually are adding 2 Black designers to our team. And the other role we ended up filling internally. And to me, that's like, these people are the right people for the job. They're exceptionally qualified. They're great people. They're great designers. They make the shape of our team better. And I'm really excited to continue to push on that. The other thing that I have to think about too is, how do we also make ourselves an inclusive work culture? It's not just about hiring and bringing people in. It's how can we make sure that basically anybody can thrive at Dropbox? And thankfully, Dropbox has got so many amazing programs set up that we're ready for that. I think many companies, you come in and you're like, you're the first woman on a leadership team, and they're not quite sure what to do with you they're like, we got a number, but what do we do with you now? And then I'll be like, here, let me tell you what to do with me. Like, that's not a warm and welcoming scenario. So making sure that it's not just like getting, a wide pipeline, getting the right people in the door, but making sure they're set up to be supported too.
Yeah, or not even treated differently, treated like as if you're equals.
But that's it. Do treat, like, to me, I'm like, do treat me differently. I was reading Kim Scott just came out with this book. It's called Just Work. And it was her, so she wrote Radical Candor, and it was in response to her realizing that Radical Candor was written from a place of privilege. And I think the difference is, like, we may not be the same. Like, we just may not. We're individuals. And so when you joke around in your bro time, like, that's not okay when I'm around. It's not okay when I'm not around. But how do we help elevate the environment where, and I'm not saying you and your bro talk, maybe, I don't know, Ben. But I think there are ways to acknowledge where, people come from different backgrounds, and how do we actually make truly inclusive environments, and actually recognize that they're probably not right now. They're probably not, because they haven't been, the environments that we work on are typically white male dominated, at least in the companies in the worlds that I live in right now. And so saying, what's the cost of that? And right now, the more I look at it, it's like, I still get recruiting emails all the time. And I look at everybody's board and everybody's leadership team, and I'm like, if you're all dudes, I don't know that that's where I want to go in and work, because I've spent the past couple of years doing the work, and I'm obligated and I'm happy to do the work, but I also need you to do the work. And I can tell that you haven't, just looking at, the faces on your leadership team.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I mean, we need whether there's the diversity or not, the just acting like, I wasn't trying to say anything weird about treat you differently. I mean, treat each other with respect all around. So it's going into the hiring, there's the diversity aspect of it, but also like a rubric just in general around quality of candidates and what you're looking for. Do you follow a rubric for how you hire? And maybe can you give some insight into that? I know we only have, unfortunately, we only have like 5 more minutes, but would love to kind of close in on.
I'll make it quick.
Yeah.
I have a firm belief that what you look for when you hire should be what you're held accountable to as your role. So if you actually have a rubric for, performance reviews, why not use that for when people are coming in? I will say the caveat is that it is really hard in an interview to comprehensively evaluate and understand who somebody is. And so being willing to create a culture of interviewing that's really about learning and less about judgment. And so that means, like, being very clear on what you're looking for. I actually call the criteria look fors. And I pulled that from my work in ed tech, where when principals and superintendents and admins come in and look in a classroom and look for good teacher behaviors, they look for these things. And so we're really just looking for them. That's all. We're like trying to get an opportunity for somebody to demonstrate that they have this thing. The other framework, it's not quite related, but it relates back to what we say. We've had success in hiring by using the Rooney Rule. I don't know who's familiar with that, but the Rooney Rule is basically, I think it's in sports ball, probably football, where head of something established that in order to do representative hiring, they'd have a panel of 4 candidates. 2 had to be women and 1 had to be a person of color. And so we do that, or we've done that at different companies and had success with that too. So it's like, how do you make sure you have the right people, the right representative people on your panel? And don't tell me that, oh, well, I have somebody, they're ready to go. And football, thank you, Bruce Daniels. At least I got the right kind of sports ball. But it's easy when your first candidate that you're interviewed, you're like, they're great, let's hire them. And it might not actually like build your team to the shape you want it to be, but it's easy and you don't want to do the work. Work isn't that hard. So yeah, making sure that you're not only like looking at the right candidates and then evaluating in a way that's looking for the things that you want and looking for that potential. And potential is a whole other topic that we don't have time to get into. But I'm warming up to it.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to say thank you for your time, for sharing your experiences with us. Hopefully it's been valuable to the group, and thank you again.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. Is there any way that people can reach out to you if they have advice? Or, I mean, it sounds like you're very open to talking to anyone.
Yep. I do, like, just to be frank, like I've learned that through this exercise and me understanding my inherent racism and how I must learn to be an anti-racist. I do prioritize people from the BIPOC community. But I'm on the Twitters all the time. I'm Jazzy33CA. It is indeed my old like college email handle, and I haven't changed it. I'm not going to change it. So I'll just pop that in the chat and y'all can find me if you'd like.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for listening, and take care.